Hello! The National Museum of the American Indian is pleased to welcome you to today's conversation with Why We Serve co-author Alexandra Harris. Without further ado, let's turn it over to our host, Mark Hirsch, for an introduction of today's presentation.
Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Mark Hirsch, Senior Historian at the National Museum of the American Indian, and I'm very pleased to host this special presentation by my colleague Alexandra Harris, with whom I co-wrote a new book entitled Why We Serve: Native Americans in the United States Armed Forces. Alex is a senior editor and writer at the National Museum of the American Indian. Her many editorial projects at the museum have earned awards for excellence in research from the Smithsonian Institution, as well as recognition from the New York Times. Prior to her work at the Smithsonian, Alex was a curator at the Verona Cultural Center and Museum in Lakeside, California. Alex will speak about the book Why We Serve for about 20 minutes. After that, I will serve as a moderator in a question and answer period in which we welcome your participation. And now I give you Alex Harris.
Thank you so much, Mark. As Mark said, I'm the co-author of our new NMAI publication honoring Native veterans, Why We Serve, which follows the history of American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian service in the US military from the Revolutionary War to today. I'm going to discuss a portion of our book that we feel sets it apart from other histories of this sort, starting with a discussion of stereotypes, then some historical evidence about the continuity of cultural practices relating to war. Out of respect for diverse and complex tribal ceremonies and traditions, I'm going to remain somewhat general about these practices unless I have permission to get into detail, and talk more about why tracing the endurance of these practices was important to us as authors as we developed the book. I'd like to recognize and thank any active duty service members and veterans tuning in. And I'd also like to acknowledge the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we're gathering, here in the Washington, D.C. area and where you are, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home here today. I'd like to begin by sharing a photograph with you, one we chose to appear as the cover image for our book. So what do you see? I'll give you a moment to take a look. We have two men wearing war bonnets. This definitely says Indians, which the publishing industry appreciates. With the bomber behind and in black and white, this suggests World War II. But what if we know these two men and their history? This is, in fact, World War II, and the two men are Kiowa service members Gus Palmer on the left and Horace Poolaw. Horace Poolaw was an aerial photographer during the war, and he became a noted photographer of his Anadarko, Oklahoma community. He photographed veterans of three wars: World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. Gus Palmer became a key figure in renewing the Kiowa Blacklegs Warrior Society in 1958 and served as its commander until his passing in 2006. Blacklegs, or leggings, was one of the military societies suppressed by the government when the Kiowa people were moved to a reservation in the late 1800s. Current society members are enrolled Kiowa citizens on active duty or honorably discharged veterans. And of course, someone who is Kiowa would have much more to say about this image. I think the principle here, the difference between what the general public might see on the surface versus what we see now knowing the history of these men and their community, is a simple way to show how understanding the context and complexity is so much more interesting and subverts stereotypes. The image is a good preface for our conversation about what is real and not real about Native American cultures as they relate to military service. I'd like to take a moment to touch on a few stereotypes and illustrate, given their history, how they were created and have been used, why they're important for us to know about. Then we'll discuss some authentic Native approaches to service. In that, I hope to convey a sense of continuity and resilience that Mark and I found as we researched these histories. First, I'd like to admit a bit of a personal conflict. As a historian, it's my job to ask questions and answer with evidence. I want to examine aspects of history and drill down to their root causes. But I recognize there's a potential in all this research and blowing apart myths to disturb how people, particularly Native veterans, imagine themselves, as many of these are what are called positive stereotypes. Please know that in examining these stereotypes, I have no desire to disrespect anyone's service or Indigenous practices or personal identities. It's happened enough over the last 250 years. But what I will do is invite you along on a brief trip through history so we can move on in an informed way to celebrate and honor Native people's real and profound contributions to military service. The photos you see here are from Indians at Work, a post-Indian New Deal newsletter out of the Federal Indian Office that began in 1933 to promote Civilian Conservation Corps wage work, and then, beginning around 1942, service in the military. I found these images in 3 consecutive spreads of the magazine, and they illustrated rather well in both images and text the 3 major ideas I'd like to examine. First, the idea that Native Americans are bloodthirsty, which is arguably the most long-standing stereotype. The image and text here tell readers that Indians love the bayonet, and further describes Indians' aggressiveness in battle. Originating in the early years of European colonial contact, the bloodthirsty image was used to justify violence and colonialism. This image was also influenced by a general misunderstanding by settlers of what they observed of Indigenous warfare, which was in a style that was often entirely foreign to the colonists, and more what we call guerrilla warfare today. Throughout the continent, tribes raided, skirmished, or fought in a range of styles, and for purposes that were mostly unlike that of European armies at the time, who sustained long campaigns with the goal of destroying an opponent completely. Given the hundreds of tribal styles of war that existed at contact, I can't generalize for all of them. But what I can say is that when Europeans came in contact with the tribes in the East, Native people were often unbeatable in their own homelands using their traditional tactics. Historian Tom Holm, a Cherokee citizen and Vietnam vet whose work during the 1980s with other Native Vietnam veterans opened my eyes to many of these issues, and I'd highly encourage you to look up his publications if you're interested. Holm calls the Native styles of war ritual warfare, as they typically had as their goal economic gain, raising status, and purposes other than wholesale killing, though there were some exceptions. The economic and social benefits of raids and small-scale skirmishes to tribes made obliterating the enemy not in their best interest. Yet, instead of acknowledging the superiority of Indian style of warfare and seeing the frequency of skirmishes between tribal enemies, Europeans instead made it evidence of their savagery and uncivilized nature. This savage image worked well for Europeans. They later used it and other stereotypes to justify taking lands, and in the 19th century, the attempted assimilation and destruction of Native culture. Native people and nations have often been recruited to the military for different reasons throughout history, including as scouts, translators, and to ally with one power or another during colonial times, and with the United States. During World War I in 1918, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs encouraged Native people to enlist because he believed it would help assimilate them further into American culture. He is the likely origin of the phrase that Indians participate in the military at a higher rate than any other ethnicity, a phrase which seems patriotic, but as you look into its history, it doesn't seem accurate for many reasons. It's complicated, and if you're curious about the history of this, I'd encourage you to read the chapter in the book about numbers, or we can discuss it more in the Q&A. What I think is most interesting here and worth some thought is the phrase's original motive and how that's changed over time. What is also curious to me is the pervasiveness of the stereotypes beyond their apparent usefulness. From the colonial years to the 1800s, the savage image justifies taking land and resources. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, it justified United States expansion and assimilation policies. But why did it continue? By the 20th century, the image of American Indians and the American Indian warrior had been woven into the American cultural identity. And we still see the US military use this stereotype today. From at least the Vietnam era, but perhaps longer, enemy territory has been called Indian country, and combatants often given indigenous code names. Osama bin Laden famously having been given the code name Geronimo during the raid that killed him, for example. This isn't coincidental, but should make us think about how American culture still thinks about American Indians, not the real version of Native people, but the idea of Native people. That first stereotype is a big one. The second image of the Native warrior we have is one who has an innate, often supernatural talent for war, particularly scouting and tracking. If you can see the tiny text, it discusses how Indians are more physically built for war than other races and have, quote, uncanny tracking and scouting abilities. Tom Holm calls this Indian Scout Syndrome. And it has been a pervasive stereotype that has resulted in Native people being placed in riskier units and positions than non-Indian counterparts, so shouldering disproportionate casualties, but also a burden of success, the pressure of living up to this ideal. I've included a quote here from Harvey Pratt, the designer of the National Native American Veterans Memorial. "It kind of shocked me," he says. "When we got to Vietnam, they would say, 'Let the Indian do that. He's good at that.' I thought, I've really got to step up and do a good job because that's what these guys expect of me." Another related idea is one of the monolithic warrior tradition, one that denies the diversity of tribal beliefs and practices and assumes all Native people are warriors. Many Native nations have warrior traditions, but others do not, and some have belief systems that focus on peace, which leads me into the next topic. In transitioning here, I want to pause and make a distinction because we're moving from a frame of unreality to reality, and I'd like to distinguish between the complex and nuanced reasons behind stereotyping and the complex and diverse reality of Native Americans in military service. So let's move ahead with that in mind. In reality, the warrior tradition is often used as a blanket statement for all Native Americans. While there are some similarities across tribes, they are very diverse approaches to traditions surrounding war. On one hand, the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois were considered to be quite fierce even before contact with Europeans, though also have a formidable history of peacemaking and diplomacy. Their great law promoted peace among previously warring tribes and consolidated them into the Five Nations Confederacy. Then you have tribes like Cheyenne, Lakota on the Great Plains, arguably the most stereotyped, for whom intertribal skirmishes established social status, and it was more honorable to count coup or touch your opponent without killing them than it was to kill. I've included a contemporary art piece here to demonstrate this by Chester Medicine Crow, depicting his grandfather Joe Medicine Crow's counting coup on a Nazi soldier in World War II. Other tribal nations such as the Hopi have had practices that focused on peace. Most tribes have practices that aided the warriors return to their community and restored balance. The Tohono O'odham people of southern Arizona and Mexico, for example, didn't seek out war, but would retaliate if raided by an enemy. In their spirituality, if you take a life, you need to recognize that you've ended a life prematurely, that they were prevented from doing the things that they were supposed to do, and live out the rest of your life in the interests of the one you took. killing someone made you unclean, and in order to rejoin your family and community, you would need to undergo an extensive cleansing ceremony. In their way, there's a great obligation involved when a life is taken. This is similar to other Native nations' practices of acknowledging the enemy as well as the member of the community who went to war, such as for the Kumeyaay, who live in San Diego and also south into Mexico. One of the ideas we wanted to communicate early on with our first exhibition, Patriot Nations, was the idea that the role of the warrior in traditional indigenous sense may be defined differently than that of a contemporary member of the military. In talking with some language speakers, warrior can have a more nuanced meaning, more akin to protector. This definition adds an extended responsibility to a warrior's home community after service that many veterans discussed with us, such as becoming a tribal leader, an activist, working to support tribal sovereignty, and protecting the land and water. A great example of this is Micheline Bigman, who's an Iraq war veteran who served on our advisory council for the National Native American Veterans Memorial and created the Native American Women Warriors, an organization that raises awareness of and offers support services to returning Native female veterans. I want to introduce a few more ideas of what Native people and communities bring to their service. The skills learned by many Native people growing up, hunting, tracking, but also patience and survival, are often the same ones attributed to their supernatural abilities. And again, I'm quoting from a recent article written about Harvey Pratt. The young Cheyenne Marine from Oklahoma knew how to handle himself in the field. We made a point of that growing up. When we were little, we would run around barefoot. We would go to the river that was maybe 5 miles away. My grandfather would say, "You need to learn to do without water." So he gave us a little pebble about the size of my thumbnail, and we put it in our mouth. He said, "Make your own water." Another example, the Coast Guard predecessor services relied heavily on Indigenous volunteers' expert knowledge of their own waterways, whether it was here in the mainland United States or in Hawaii. After European contact, by necessity, Native people had to adapt their methods of war, but Native people have always adapted and innovated to changing circumstances. Many stereotypes about Native American peoples arise from the idea that Indians' images should somehow be frozen in the 18th or 19th century. So what I've been talking about over the last few minutes has been true at particular times. Traditions have changed, some were lost. Though many tribes wanted to continue their ritual warfare after European contact, by necessity it changed. Some tribes adopted the horse to great effect. People carried medicine to historical wars and still do. By medicine, I'm using a big word for many things, which could include personal medicine for protection, herbs and other medicinal items for treating illness and injuries, and so on. Here are a couple 20th and 21st century examples of enduring traditions. On the right is Turkey Tyak, who was Piscataway from Maryland and brought his medicinal skills with him from the Chesapeake to France during World War I. He even harvested medicine while he was there and used it to heal fellow soldiers who had been burned by mustard gas. It might seem strange to place an image of a stickball game here, but many Native nations associated the game with battle. It sometimes acted as a substitute for war. There's even a story during the Civil War where a Cherokee detachment of Thomas's Confederate Legion were, quote, left to guard a bridge, became so engrossed in the excitement of the game as to narrowly escape capture by a sudden dash of the Federals. What also remains true in many respects is that service members are seen as sacrificing on behalf of the people. Preparatory ceremonies act as a pact with the community, an agreement that the service member will be supported when they return. Some traditions even see a war itself as something the entire community needs to grieve, mourn, and heal from. The psychological damage is understood to affect the warrior as well as the community. The psychological aspect of cleansing and healing is something Western science has been slow to come to, but which Native customs have historically integrated into many different practices. These practices recognize that a person has chosen to enter a state of imbalance, that the knowledge and experience gained during war is recognized, and that they have become a different person when they return. They're not expected to return in their previous state, but be cleansed and gain a new identity. Code talker Carl Gorman's painting illustrates the Diné, or Navajo enemy way ceremony, which restores balance, or hojo, and counters negative effects of being around death. This quote comes from an interview done several years ago with code talker Samuel Tso for our education website on code talkers, Native Words, Native Warriors, the updated version of which just launched this week, so please check it out. Samuel Tso says, "Before we hit the beach, the officer on that ship, he tell us to pray in your own belief. Me, I just took out my corn pollen as I was told by our medicine man, and then pray. So I think some of the kids joined me to pray." I'd like to take a moment to recognize that along with those Native service members that reside in their communities and retain their healing practices, there are others, tribes who over time have lost ceremonies or have had them suppressed, or individuals who have been distanced from their community for one reason or another, who may not have that connection to healing, nor the acceptance and reintegration into their community when they returned home. After Vietnam, powwows, particularly those put on by the Vietnam-era Veterans Intertribal Association, have offered a space for veterans to come, be recognized, seek camaraderie, and to heal. In the 1980s, two psychologists, Silver and Wilson, studied the effects of Native ceremonies, those that prepared, cleansed, and reintegrated a service member into their family and community, as well as the success of pan-tribal events, meaning that multiple tribes participate, like powwows and traditions such as sweat lodges, on healing. They concluded that Western science has a lot to learn from the psychological awareness of Indigenous methods of ceremony and healing, and that a combination of Native and Western medicine had a significant positive impact on a Native service member's healthy return home. In the process of researching our book, we learned about some communities who are working to recover their practices. I spoke to a Native Hawaiian Vietnam veteran, Thomas Kaulakukui, who is a martial arts and Lua practitioner, Lua being a Native Hawaiian martial art. He's working with other veterans to recreate a cleansing ceremony that allows returning veterans to transition from a state of war to peace in order to rejoin their community. Having lost this knowledge, they are rebuilding it by using Hawaiian and Polynesian cultural knowledge, a small historical record, and by testing and tweaking it until it works. Here, I'm sharing 3 photographs of lua ai, or holds, that have been used for generations in Native Hawaiian cultures. This discussion hopefully underlines the meaning of the National Native American Veterans Memorial, and one of the chief intentions of it being a source of healing. All of this represents a fierce resilience, whether you call it a warrior spirit or something else. We may have overused the following phrase at the NMAI, but there is a powerful feeling still in Indian country, and with most veterans I spoke with, to declare that we are still here. And I hope they know that we did our best to listen and hear what they had to say. This is a challenging topic. The history of Native peoples in this country can be dark, and war is darker still. but I think there are lessons and stories here from which we can learn and draw strength. My colleague Mark Hirsch and I hope that we've conveyed that strength and continuity in our book. I hope you've enjoyed this talk and look forward to answering your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alex. Really, really inspiring and thought-provoking talk. This begins our Q&A period. We would very much welcome the audience's questions or comments. So before we go to the audience questions, I think I'm going to take advantage of my position as a moderator today to ask the first question. And that is, Alex, can you perhaps place the subject of your presentation in the context of the book, Why We Serve, Native Americans in the United States Armed Forces? I'm curious to know how the discussion or the presentation rather that we had today fits into the larger context of the book. What kinds of themes does the book explore, and what ultimately do you want people to know from the book?
Thanks, Mark. And I think you'll agree with me on these since we've talked about them for now 3 years. So, but yeah, it's hard to get an idea of the full scope of the book from my talk about one slice of it today. But we had some really broad goals with this book. And first and foremost, we really wanted it to be different from those attempts at encapsulating this history before. And to do that, we, I think first and foremost, wanted to make it people forward. And by that phrase, I mean, we wanted Native people's voices to come through in every era. So for me, and I'm putting words in your mouth, Mark, we wanted to try to find interviews from as many eras as possible. If we could find written materials, even as far back as the Revolutionary War, at least descriptions of conversations, we did that. So, and I'm sure I think I saw a question blowing through the chat about how we pulled together this research. It's a combination of interviews that we did ourselves with Native veterans, historical research, but also a synthesis of the historical writings, the writings done by historians that have come before us. We also wanted to get away from the romanticism that so often plagues discussions of Native people, and particularly Native veterans. So for this, we take a more pragmatic view. We asked questions. Why I focused on this subject was because this was something that teasing apart stereotypes, getting into replacing it with the reality of the traditions and practices surrounding war is something that really hasn't been a part of previous literature. But I always say, I remember that one conversation where I called you up and I said, I'm looking at this history and I'm seeing these themes. Are you seeing what I'm seeing? The stereotype of the fierce, bloodthirsty savage, the Indian scout syndrome, as Tom Holmes says. Why don't we address these head on? And so attacking stereotypes was a big theme for us. And I think the title often confuses people, maybe assuming that we're going to provide an answer for why Native people serve. And that's actually, we try to turn that on its head and say that every individual has their own reason for service, and that there are so many motivations and pressures upon Native people, whether it's for patriotism on one hand, wanting to gain an education, or poverty, getting out of poverty or a bad life situation. So those are sort of the major themes that we put across in our book, and so yeah, I just really feel honored to be able to present these stories.
Thank you for that. That really, I think, summarizes the book really nicely, and where your presentation today basically fits within that larger context. We've gotten quite a number of questions from the audience, and they're all really interesting. I'm just going to read out the ones that have come to me first. So here comes one that I think gets to the nub of the issue. Why do Native Americans want to fight for this country that has treated them so badly?
It's a central question, and I think one that is difficult to answer. But when we heard from veterans, I don't think that there is a lot of thought given in the moment that for Native people who have enlisted in the military. The pressures are different, whether it's an obligation, traditional obligation to defend your homeland, or protect your community is a stronger motivation than thinking about a darker history. And ultimately, this is their land, and that's a huge theme that comes through in the historic documentation of how Native people have reflected on their own service. From World War II veterans, Korean, they discuss everything from, treaty obligations, that saying, the United States may not have upheld them, but we can still do that, and be an ally. So there are many different reasons. It's a good question. I think over the years, the US government has asked the same question. For example, in World War II, the military had the chance to expand the code talking the program, but chose not to, because later in World War II started doubting the allegiance of Native people. Well, what are they really saying when they're speaking their language? So I think that question has been more of a criticism coming from the outside, or a fear coming from the outside, than what we heard from Native people themselves.
Right. Thank you for that. One of the other questions we're getting from numerous people actually is, there is this idea that Native people have served in the armed forces than really any other group in American society, or at least at a higher rate, I should say, than any other group in American society. And I guess the issue is that true insofar as your research shows?
Sure, I've seen this. I'm taking a quick look at the Q&A. I also see, Kevin Van Wanseel, hi, is asking that question. Hi to your family. I'm seeing a lot of familiar names throughout the country. Hawaii, Alaska, hello. It's an honor to have you here with us. I knew people would be really curious about this statement, because it's something that we've all heard for, at least as far as we can tell, 100 years. It's an emotional statement that Native people serve at a greater rate than any other ethnicity. Is it true? I can't say it's not. It has been true probably at certain times during the 20th century particularly. Some of it depends on how Native people are counted. And I'll use World War II as an example. The not even the Census Bureau and the Bureau of Indian Affairs could settle on a number of, how they defined Native Americans and what number there were in the United States. They defined Native people differently. The military hasn't actually had an official category for Native service until 1980 or 2000 in some branches, and that's only for sole, if you choose one race. If you choose more than one race, you go into an other or mixed race category. So the accuracy of numbers is really fuzzy. for me personally, I wanted to examine this because I wanted to understand. I mean, as historians, we want to make sure that if we're putting this idea forward, it's true, right? So I appealed to the Department of Defense. Where are your numbers? We compared them with census numbers. So we have some solid numbers that, at least at present, don't really support this statement. But of course, again, that mixed race category really offsets. I mean, ostensibly, there are Native people in this category. So we really don't have a solid grasp on actual numbers.
Right.
To me, the origin of the phrase is suspect. So Cato Sells, who's the Commissioner of Indian Affairs back in 1918 during the World War I, was an assimilationist. He believed that by encouraging Native people to enlist in the military, that would further assimilate them into American society. He was also really interested in acquiring Native lands. So he thought, well, if they further assimilate, maybe we can work on allotting their lands, maybe in their tradition of sacrifice during war, we can encourage them to sacrifice land for the cause of patriotism, for example. So you can see where, because I couldn't find an earlier occurrence of this statement, I was very suspicious and cautious. And I want to be really careful because I feel like this is a statement that is a source of pride. When you scratch the surface, it's more complicated, right? Because it assumes that Native people are only serving because they're patriotic. But as we know, everybody's approach to service is individual. It's influenced by their community, their family, their own situation in life. So what I guess I'm saying about this statement is, let's be careful about how we use it. Know the history of it, be mindful. And frankly, I think the more powerful idea, the one that replaces this with some accuracy, is that despite, and this references the earlier question, despite what Native people have experienced in this history, Native people have served in the United States military for more than, for 250 years, and were the first allies of this nascent country. And that is huge. They have served in huge numbers when called to do so. The indigenous traditions that mark a warrior's sacrifice, protecting community and their way of life, land and water, sovereignty and self-government, these are the elements that are so strong in this history. That in itself, I think, is worth deep respect. The statement also obscures some of the history of the tribal responses to war itself. For example, again, going back to World War II, we have tribes who objected to the draft because they didn't believe, they stood up for their own sovereignty and said, you can't draft us. We're a sovereign nation. And on the other hand, you have other tribes who reportedly 70% or more of their eligible population, men, enlisted. So there's it's a really complicated history of this phrase, and a really fascinating one, and one it was a surprise to understand.
We have so many good questions. As I said before, we will not have time to answer all of them live. I'm sure Alex will try very hard to write you a typed answer afterwards. But we do have time for one or two other questions. Alex, one of the questions that came in was, how did you actually do the research for this book? Did you send out surveys? Did you interview people? What were the sources that were used to put the book together?
That's a great question. And I answered it just a little bit before, but I can go into it a little bit more detail, because one of the wonderful resources we had in front of us was the consultations that that our museum did with tribes all over the United States, Alaska, and Hawaii for the planning of the National Native American Veterans Memorial. And I believe there were 32, 33 consultations, and we listened. And so when we sat down to write this book, we looked at some of these transcripts. What do people want to put forward about their own service? And I also, we both interviewed veterans. I think not to the extent that we wanted to because of time, but we also analyzed the literature that's been written out there previously as well. So it's really an amalgamation of many, many different approaches.
One more question, I think, is quite interesting, actually, I think, and as they all are. One of the questions we got here is, do you think native languages could and would be used again in warfare, which I gather is a reference to the code talkers, of course, of World War I and II. Kind of an interesting question. Do you have any thoughts about that, Alex?
I don't know. I mean, it'd be interesting to talk to you about it, Mark. Just to, in the reflecting on history, what I think there is always value in one of the central values of using native languages was that they are a language, right? They aren't something contrived like a code. Languages are flexible. Some languages can discuss certain concepts better than other languages can. So I think there's always value in considering the usefulness of language. It's a great question to think about.
I think there's probably time for just one more. One of the questions that came in is what do Native servicemen and women think of the use of stereotyped or use of tribal names for different military programs and strategies and tactics?
That's a good question. And I think there's a spectrum like anything. We profiled a couple in our book, naming I believe the Apache helicopters have a blessing from the I don't, forgive me, recall which band of Apache. It is in our book. So there's a relationship between the Apache people and the military in that way. And then there are other, like the Zuni rocket. I would love to know what Zuni people feel about having a rocket named after them. I'm really not sure about their own traditions surrounding war, and that probably relates. So yeah, I think there's a spectrum. I think there's a general acknowledgement that stereotypes about Native people in the military can be very harmful. For example, the fact that in the military, like I mentioned, Indian country is still used as a synonym as for enemy territory, and having Native names, evoking people in our Native history, and and naming things or tribes even, and naming things after them, it can be problematic. I would say that it really connects closely to the mascot issue, and if there's a relationship and it's done with respect with the tribal involvement, there can be a great partnership and growth there. And if not, there's a potential for harm.
Thank you, Alex. I'm afraid that's about all the time we have to answer questions today, but I certainly want to thank everybody for joining us. As I said, we will try to respond to your questions and comments, but we really want to thank you very, very much for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much.